Between the 18th and 19th century, nearly 1/5 of Switzerland up and left. 500,000 people who were starving, persecuted, overpopulated, and industrialized just picked up their things and headed off for the New World. That's a percentage of immigration that overshot even most of the colonial powers of that time. And yet you almost never hear anything about the Swiss in the Americas. They didn't leave that imprint that we remember as history. There was no bang. The government conquered no land. Their arrival heralded no genocide. They just came and farmed. But on that rare occasion, like here in Uruguay, their legacy still hangs in the air like that faint smell of cheese. Today's story is about the Schweizer folk, and this is Nueva Helvetica. Maybe it's the sound of music or the €7 croissants, but we've all sort of seemed to accept that the Swiss are best defined by their wealth and neutrality. That's their thing. That's been their place in the world for as long as virtually any living person can remember, and there's basically no media that's painting them as otherwise. It's actually hard for me to imagine them as poor. But poor they once were, and the massive technological upheavals of the 18th century created a population boom there that drove that poverty to its very limits. In that 1 century alone, Switzerland doubled in size, or at least population. 1.25 million people became 2.5, and it didn't exactly double their land. So while these medical breakthroughs now meant that second and third sons who would have once died in childbirth were now surviving to adulthood, it also meant that there was nothing left for them to inherit. The family farm can't go to everybody. You can only split it so many ways. And on top of that, a new era of thinking had come to pass, and the laws that would have once allowed them to find fortune abroad as mercenaries were now being abandoned. Switzerland was aiming to keep its manpower at home, however poor that manpower was. In turn, the cities swelled and burst with the unemployed. And alongside all of this rose the factories. In 1801, for the first time in Swiss history, the canton of St. Gallen imported a textile factory from England, a third-generation one. They were a bit late. But in turn, they learned how to produce those machines, and within a few years, they'd begun a rapid development towards industrialization that would change their entire society forever. For the factory owners, the population boom of that last century was like this serendipitous miracle, because the more people living in poverty, the better. The more people they had, the more workers. The more workers, the lower the pay. And the lower the pay, the more capital for the owner, and the more they could compete with their neighbors. There wasn't even really any social guilt attached to it at this point. In the 1790s, OG prosperity gospel evangelist Thomas Malthus basically said, well, the poor have it coming. They're basically like deer. They're just going to keep overpopulating and dying in cycles of starvation anyway, so if you give them more money, it's only going to lead to more children, and that's just going to bring on the starvation faster. So what can you even do with them? The naturally intelligent and worthy people, rich people, on the other hand, would always be rich, and therefore why should they care? This was the natural course of things. You don't mess with the deer. And you will not be surprised to find that this worldview was very popular among the rich. Among the poor, less so. But the only real way that they could show that, well, without being killed in response, was to just pack up and leave. So in the mid-1800s, with Switzerland experiencing 2 major famines, people did just that. Very little help was sent to the bottom. This wasn't just a period of poverty. It was a period of poverty so deep and so black that the options were essentially leave the country or starve to death in the street. One by one, then by the thousands, people started to leave Switzerland. Those feeling persecuted by their religion, those feeling unsafe from Europe's convulsions, those who were just watching their families starve in front of their eyes. Each left for their own individual reasons, but no matter the reason they left, they did. The Americas might have had their problems, sure, but at least there was food. There was freedom. For their part, Uruguay needed people. The wars of independence were now all civil. Britain had basically silently guaranteed their existence, and now they needed to fill some vacancies. And just as the wealthy landowners and factory heads of Switzerland were pretty pissed to see those people leaving, the New World was thrilled to see them arrive. And few more than Uruguay, because after all, they weren't exactly the first on the list for most colonists. Most Europeans had not even heard of the country. It was basically brand new. But in the 1850s, America was looking mighty tense, and by the end of that decade, they were going to be in a vicious civil war. Some colonists, at least for that 10-year period, started to look south and think, doesn't seem that bad. The people that Malthus had deemed as useless little deer came to the Americas and showed the skills that they truly had. In the Swiss colony they founded here in Uruguay, the trade for the poor was simple. If you came here and worked, and never drank, this is very important, they said it twice in the contract, if you never drank, you were obligated a good meal and a place to stay. The value of a person here wasn't written in their birth. Of course, that still played an incredibly strong role, but they could also still give something to the community and grow from it. In a place like Uruguay, especially a newly found country virtually empty of people, if you had a skill, you'd probably find opportunity to use it. It was a chance to better your life, to better your station for your children, to be born as more than what Malthus said you were going to be. When those Swiss arrived in Uruguay, it had only just opened up to the non-Spanish. It would have been uncomfortable for both sides. There would have been people praising a different god, speaking a different language, and upholding a different culture as neighbors, and insular people who didn't want to adapt to the culture around them, people who felt different. But for Uruguay, this was less important than the fact that they would come and they would work. They would be bringing skills to a country that needed them. They were manpower, they were ideas, and just because the country couldn't get a good God-fearing Spaniard to set up shop doesn't mean they were going to kick out the next best thing. In 1862, they formally founded the town that would eventually become Nueva Helvetica. And through it, they introduced to this region virtually everything that we now associate with the Swiss. Well, perhaps except watches. I didn't see any watches. But they did bring cheese-making skills and advancements in dairy technology, as you would imagine. They brought ideas of democracy, which they used to hold secret votes for their leaders. The first democratic votes in the country, if I'm not mistaken. They also brought the Protestant religion, which isn't in and of itself a good thing, but in the entirely Catholic Uruguay, it forced them to incorporate religious diversity at a starting point, at a young age. But really, most of all, what they brought was manpower. They brought farmers. They built up the land. These were a different people from their neighbors. Surrounding them were colonies of Italian, Spanish, Austrian, and French immigrants trying the exact same thing in their own regional colonies, in their own unique flavor. But despite having that different culture from them, that different language, that different religion and history, it didn't take long before they all just sort of became Uruguayan. By the early 1900s, famous Swiss locals would be sporting names such as Juan Carlos and Pedro Ignacio. You know, classic Swiss names. Their local delicacies would be taken and adapted to become national treasures. What were once uniquely Swiss cheeses were now Uruguayan. The culture would learn to accommodate them just as they would it. The thing most associated with the Swiss in this country is undoubtedly Colonia, a type of cheese. It doesn't taste anything like what I think people would normally expect when they hear the word Swiss cheese, but that's kind of the point I'm making. They didn't bring the region with them. They didn't bring the geography. They didn't bring the cows. They brought themselves, the knowledge. It isn't the cheese that's Swiss. It's just Swiss-inspired. On the walls of this town, people are proudly putting up a symbol to say that this is the canton that their forebears came from. But virtually nobody inside those houses speaks German. I tried with over 50 people, and only one person could speak back, which I'm not shaming them for. Some of them even spoke a little Italian, but they just said, for the most part, this is my ancestry. Which I understand. My ancestry also contains Hungarian, but I don't speak Hungarian. Canada speaks English, so I speak English. Uruguay speaks Spanish, so they speak Spanish. The locals put on a yearly festival here to celebrate Swiss Confederation that lasts a month. That's beyond anything they do in Switzerland. But at the same time, I don't think almost anyone putting it on here knows the history behind it. It's not a celebration of Swiss Confederation truly, it's an Uruguayan party. And the flags in the center of this town are waving with Swiss memories, but at the same time, it's no longer just a memory for the people who were descended from those original folk, but this entire country as a whole. The Americas are immigrant continents, and just because the history books don't remember doesn't mean that the story here is no more than war and genocide. Uruguay remembers the skill of those farmers, not in the texts, but in their markets. They honor their memory with their vote. You don't need to be born somewhere to change its culture. The world doesn't need to know your name for you to be remembered. This was once New Helvetica, and now it's almost 200 years old. This is Uruguay. This is Rare Earth.